Welcome to Global Finance Rewired, the podcast series where we explore reforms to the international financial architecture. I'm Bodo, I'm your host. Today we're going to explore a critical issue, the debt crisis in the Global South, and in particular in many countries of the African continent. The United Nations has just released figures that currently more than 3 billion people live in countries whose governments spend more money on debt service than on health and education combined. And we say that each dollar spent on debt service is a dollar not spent on poverty eradication, on providing public goods, on sustainable development. So there are huge opportunity costs to this situation. And one key challenge is, of course, that we lack institutions in the international financial architecture, both to prevent that crisis or to resolve it in a speedy, fair, and sustainable manner. So that architecture reform has been a big issue in international policy debates in recent months, including recently at the fourth International Conference on Financing for Development in Seville. And I have the pleasure today to welcome an expert on the issue, Samantha Kanoyangwa. Welcome, Samantha. Samantha is the coordinator of the African Sovereign Debt Justice Network. She has worked on these topics for quite some time, and she also submitted a good research article to our recent report on international financial architecture reform on the social legitimacy crisis of the International Monetary Fund. Nice to have you, Samantha.
Thank you for having me, Bodo.
Well, to kick this off, can you explain us a little bit more about yourself, or can you tell us a bit more about yourself and the network that you coordinate?
Yeah, thank you, Bodo. My name is Samantha Kanoyangwa, and I'm a lawyer. I'm also an activist, social economic rights activist, and I have worked with Afronomics Law for quite a bit now. Afronomics Law is the organization that works at the intersection of law and economics in Africa. And so the Afronomics Law hosts the network, which is the one you've just mentioned, the African Sovereign Debt Justice Network. That's the network I coordinate. So the network is made up of it's a coalition of civil society organizations, activists, religious groups, and any average African Zimbabwean who is in the business of pushing for a much fairer international financial architecture, one that realizes that Africa should actually have a voice and representation when we're talking about global economic governance. And so that's the network I work for, which is hosted by Afronomics Law.
And to introduce the topic today, can you give us some facts and figures on the debt situation in Africa? Why is it such a big problem?
Yeah, so first of all, I think it's important for me to highlight that we are actually in a crisis as Africa. Africa is facing a lot of issues stemming from the debt crisis that we're currently facing. And it's also important to highlight that this just did not wake up and become an issue. It has been years and years and years of misgovernance, both at the international level and at the domestic level. And so at the international level, for example, you're talking about the ESAP era, where we had the structural programs where the IMF as the leading voice on global economic governance, especially with regard to debt, was giving advice in quotes to African governments to take on austerity measures just so that they ensure that they service debt, but also cut on social spending, also cut down on healthcare, also cut down on education, which are very critical areas for a country's growth and developmental trajectory. And so it's been years and years of this, and then also at a domestic level, it has just been a lot of irresponsible borrowing, but also important to highlight that there's also an aspect of irresponsible lending that also took place. And so it's just been a lot of misgovernance at both levels that has also just resulted in this crisis that we are in today, where we find African governments not being able to have the fiscal space to at least invest in their own countries and their own people. And instead, they actually are doing a lot of debt servicing, and it just ends up being a crisis that we are experiencing today.
And some countries in Africa seem to be stuck in this situation for quite some time already. I mean, in some countries, let's take Zambia, Ethiopia, it seems to be, it's known for several years already that they cannot repay the debt space, but still there is no solution. What's the reason why it takes such a long time to solve that crisis in African countries?
Yeah, so Zambia, Ethiopia, and Ghana as well have been under the Common Framework. the G20 Common Framework. And it has just taken a lot of time for these countries to actually reach a debt restructuring deal with their different creditors. And the number one reason why it has just taken so long is that it's, first of all, we need to realize that there are a lot of different kind of creditors into play. So you've got the multilateral institutions, you've got the private lenders, you also have got the private bondholders. And so it has just been difficult to have all of these groups at the same table to discuss, say, Ghana's debt restructuring or Ethiopia's debt restructuring, even Zambia. And Zambia has been a very prime example, especially if you're looking at the comparability of treatment principle, where it's still been difficult to just have all these groups come together and agree on what the terms and conditions of Zambia's debt restructuring could look like. And so at the international level, when we're talking about how it has been difficult for these countries to come to a resolution, a debt resolution, it has been just the identification of this problem being a fragmented approach to debt restructuring, where we don't have a coordinated response to say if a country is facing such a debt crisis and needs to be built out in such a way that it reaches a debt resolution, then we are supposed to follow this coordinated approach, which is, you know, fair, which is comprehensive, which is transparent, but also very predictable. So that is the number one challenge. And there's no legal framework to begin with, because at least when you have a legal framework, then it becomes binding. So you then have all these creditors bound by law to actually follow this coordinated approach, this transparent approach, this predictable approach. And so these are some of the issues that we have been facing with Ghana, with Ethiopia, with Zambia, but also to mention Zimbabwe, because I come from Zimbabwe. And Zimbabwe's situation has been a bit different because it's not looking at debt restructuring or arrears clearance under the G20 Common Framework. Zimbabwe has resorted to at least try and look inwardly and see if it can engage with its international partners and also the creditors at a table and discuss how we could resolve our arrears and then also look into the debt restructuring. But also it has been quite problematic. There has been some progress where the international partners and creditors have then said, oh, you need to follow ABCD. So first of all, you need to follow the governance reforms. They are requiring governance reforms, fix your human rights violations, make sure that you have got good governance in play, your electoral systems and all of that. And the economic governance, they're looking at just having a stable economy. So have a stable economy, have a predictable currency, one that works, that can actually be used even outside Zimbabwe. Right now, we don't have a currency that works outside Zimbabwe. And then we also have the compensation of the white farmers. So you will recall at some point Zimbabwe took land from the white farmers when we had our land reform program, but that was not at law. And so by law, we are required to then compensate them. And so it's something that they're also calling for. And until we have fixed all those three reforms that they're calling for, that's when we can actually have a discussion on, okay, how do we restructure our debt? So it's just been a lot of different approaches to different situations. It's an ad hoc kind of approach that has been taken to the resolution of Africa's debt crisis.
You mentioned a lot of problems with the current systems. You mentioned fragmentation, the absence of a legal framework, onerous conditionality, often not really tailored to the country's needs, but to creditors' desires. Let's look at the solutions. What are you advocating for as African Sovereign Debt Justice Network? How could better institutions to solve sovereign debt crisis look like?
So yeah, you've just put it quite right. It's just about pushing for the creditors' interests as opposed to what are the African government's needs. And so we have identified, as the network, we've identified that this is a very much creditor-led kind of discussion, or even the solutions that they're looking for, they're creditor-led. And so we're looking for solutions that would be fair to all, both creditors and the debtors as well. And so we're looking at the reform. Overall, we're looking at the reform of the international financial architecture, where we're saying the current system is skewed towards the creditors. It's always about what do the creditors want? How do they want this crisis to be resolved? But if we have a situation, or at least a system, that allows for the debtors' representation, for their voice to be heard, and also for their needs to be actually be considered when these negotiations are happening, then at least we'll have a much fairer system, a much transparent system, a comprehensive system that ensures that both sides are actually heard. And so this system, we envision that it would be housed within the United Nations. And why the United Nations? We believe that this is the most democratic platform to handle such issues. Right now, when we're talking about debt restructuring, the first thing we think of is the IMF, because the IMF has been at the helm of global economic governance for quite long. I think it's over 8 years now. And so we are thinking we should have the reform of the international financial architecture that also looks into the institutions that would be running such conversations, or at least guiding such conversations. And for us, that should be the United Nations and not the IMF and not the World Bank and not those global economic powerhouses, which have got so much power within these institutions that I've just mentioned. We also think that there would be need for the legal framework that I mentioned that really governs global economic governance, especially with the debt restructuring. So we need a debt restructuring mechanism. We would need a sovereign debt workout mechanism. We would also need a global debt authority that guides this kind of mechanism we're talking about. And like I said, we think this would be the UN. The UN at least affords all countries a voice. It's almost like that concept where we had liberation and democratic conversations where it's one man, one vote. So essentially it would be one country, one vote, as opposed to the current system where we have the whole of Africa under 7% for their voice, and yet we have countries like America with about 16-17% in the IMF. And so those are some of the things that we envision. We also think about how important it is for us to have responsible lending and borrowing practices. And when we're talking about responsible lending and borrowing practices, we're essentially talking about how we need to have both creditors and debtors taking due diligence when they're negotiating such contracts. So if a creditor, for example, has a proposal from an African government, or at least an African government is coming to the creditor and saying, oh, can you please lend us some money? The creditor has got a duty to ensure that the debtor actually has got the apt transparency and accountability mechanisms to ensure that that money will actually be used for the purpose that it has been borrowed for. We need to ensure that they have the capacity to even repay that kind of money. The debtor also has to make sure that the creditor is a legit creditor, a creditor that is, very much within the ambit of the law and does not have any rogue activities that they perform. And so both due diligence is required from both sides. Now, when we have this, then it means at least we have got a starting point when it comes to transparency and accountability measures. It will ensure that responsible borrowing and lending practices actually happen, and we won't have African governments in this perpetual cycle, in this perpetual trap of debt repayments. And we think that it will be important for us to have a legal framework that actually guides that kind of thing. At the moment, it's mostly soft law that we have. We have I know there's the guiding principles on borrowing and lending, but we also have the AfroDebt borrowing charter, which sort of guides the African governments on what they should be on the lookout for when they're signing these contracts. But at least if we have an international kind of structure that would be very much legal in nature and binding, that would really help. Yeah.
Okay, no, I think you mentioned you squeezed a lot of institutional innovations in one response to my questions. If I may summarize, I think you do a legal framework. I mean, under the auspices of the United Nations, I think is a key point, a legal framework, a debt authority, and also a debt workout mechanism. And that's on the resolution side. And on the prevention side, responsible lending and borrowing. Let's come to this conflict of issues, United Nations versus the IMF. Do you still see the role for would you say the IMF can still be, the International Monetary Fund can still be reformed, or what role would you attribute to the International Monetary Fund in future debt workout processes?
I think currently the IMF sort of like takes the leading role, and this is primarily because it has this card of the bailout packages that it usually gives to African governments, especially when they're at the edge of debt default. And so I think it has just been in a space where it's really close to the African governments, and African governments literally take on anything that the IMF says, especially when it comes to then even the debt restructuring. So it's a lot of advice that's being taken from the IMF. But I think going forward, if we're looking at the reform of the international financial architecture, I think the IMF would really be taking a backseat in this kind of discussions. The African governments, I envision, should be the ones leading these conversations with their creditors. And so the IMF could, fall under the ambit of multilateral institutions. And essentially, that would be their role as a creditor to discuss how they can reach a debt resolution with the African government, and not be the one being the umpire between the African governments and the other creditors, including the private bondholders or the private lenders. So I think the IMF has essentially been taking this role of both a player and an umpire in a game. So if it's a soccer game, so that's the picture that I have. But if we are looking at the reform of the international architecture, I think the IMF should just remain as a player. That's if it is a player in that particular game. And if it's not a player, then it should really not be in the business of discussing the restructuring of these countries, unless an African government actively seeks its advice, which I would not think would be so ideal. I actually think that we've got a lot of very much educated African people, and even African policy think tanks, and all those kind of institutions that would be better able to inform African governments on what approach to take. Even the law firms have been actively working in these kind of areas, and one of our works at Afronomics Law has been to guide law firms as to how they should be approaching such kind of conversations, especially in the capital markets area, where we are really looking forward to them not just looking at things, with blinkers. In law school, you're just taught to look at what the contract says and how it can benefit your client. But we've been really trying to ensure that as they even help the private lenders in just maybe say explaining the current landscape in an African government, they should be able to ensure that they do so with the best interests of the government and not be profit-led. So I think those are some of the situations. I think it's very important for us to even look for advice in our own institutions. I know the African Development Bank has its own facility, the Africa Legal Support Facility, ALSF, which has been doing great work with regards to advisory for African governments. And so we should be looking more inwardly. At Afronomics Law, at the African Sovereignty Justice Network, we have been doing that as well. We've done that with the government of Zambia, and we're also looking into having more countries on board where we offer these kind of advisory opinions and ensure that when they get into these negotiating rooms, they're more equipped to negotiate for better outcomes. So I think, the role of the IMF really has to be dwindled. There's been a lot of centering of the IMF in almost every kind of approach to debt resolution for the African governments, and that really needs to be dwindled.
Okay, so a leading role for the United Nations and a very much reduced role for the IMF, and there are regional alternatives also to these global institutions. We are running out of time already, but perhaps one last question for you, because there are a number of political processes starting now at the United Nations. There will be an intergovernmental process working on debt architecture reform, but the UN Secretary General is also going to convene a working group on responsible lending and borrowing. And you already mentioned that is a key topic also for the prevention of debt crisis, responsible lending and borrowing. You mentioned some principles already, but if you would make a submission to this working group, or what would be the 3 key points you say should feature in a list of United Nations endorsed principles on responsible lending and borrowing?
Yeah, for responsible lending and borrowing, firstly, I think due diligence is very important, and that's on both ends, on the government's end and on the creditors' ends. I think it's very important that we conduct due diligence. I think it's important for at least a lot of transparency and accountability mechanisms to be put out there, and so outrightly and so explicit, to an extent that this would actually be part of the debt contracts or loan contracts that are signed. So I think that should be very important as well. I think part of that responsible lending and borrowing framework should also include something along the lines of debt pauses, especially when countries are in crisis. Right now in Africa, our biggest threat is the climate change. that we are actually facing the crisis that we are facing, the impact that we are facing. And so it will be important for such a framework to also make sure that it includes debt pauses in such contracts, so that it actually helps with the lending and borrowing process and even the repayment, which then ensues. I did mention transparency and accountability mechanisms, but good governance as well. I think a lot of the times when we talk about transparency and accountability, we leave out good governance. But without good governance, it's almost difficult to achieve transparency and accountability. So it's very important for good governance to really prevail, and good governance, under the environmental, social, and good governance kind of ambit. So the ESG would be very important. But it also, I think it's very important for us to, at the end of the day, tie this to the Sustainable Development Goals, which is the 2030 agenda, and very much near to us. It's very much fast approaching. I think it's very important for us. Yeah.
No, these were more than 3 already, but you're right. There's a long list of factors to consider when we talk about responsible lending and borrowing, and it's great. I mean, it's great to see a new dynamic also in the international arena at the United Nations to work on these issues, both of debt architecture reforms and on prevention of debt crisis now following the United Nations conference in Sevilla. So we hope that it's going to lead to some positive results soon. So thank you very much, Samantha. Unfortunately, we have to stop here, but well, thank you for joining, and it was great to have you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, and for all our listeners and viewers, thank you as well for joining. This was the 3rd episode of Global Finance Rewired. We looked at this episode on debt architecture reforms, the debt crisis, and responsible lending and borrowing. The 4th episode is going to be on a quite similar topic, or on a related topic, which is the regional financial architecture in Africa and related reforms, so we can continue. And we hope you enjoyed the episode. If you did, please leave us a review, a like, or forward our podcast to other interested parties. And yeah, we look forward to welcoming you again next week. And thank you very much, Samantha, for your input today.
Thank you for having me.